Hi everyone, thanks for joining today. My name is Armen, and I'm going to host the first NG Meetup Yerevan. I'm a senior Angular developer at VOLO and a tech writer. Most people attending our meeting probably at this point know me, but it's always a good idea to introduce oneself. So as I mentioned, I work at VOLO, and VOLO is a software development company based in Yerevan. And we are working on enterprise solutions, also using, of course, Angular. And why we decided to do this meetup is because approximately 2 years ago, we started doing internal meetings, meetups, presentations, and even full-blown learning courses to help our employees and especially Angular developers in this context to share knowledge and share expertise between each other so that we can grow and learn more. After doing this stuff for 2 years, we thought that it's finally time to try to go on a broader scale and try to share our expertise with people outside of our company. So we decided that it would probably be a good idea to do a meetup, especially in the times that lots of people outside Armenia are experiencing all of these COVID-related problems like lockdowns and everything. We thought that making an online event would be a great idea. So we had this idea and worked on it. And as I mentioned, because I'm also a tech writer, some of you might be familiar with some of my articles. I am part of different communities of writers. Like In-Depth and This is Angular or This is Learning, these are related communities. So I had the opportunity to get to know different experts and writers and open source contributors from different countries. So I decided that we can broaden our audience, that we can bring people from different countries to this online event. And of course, we wanted to have a special guest on our show today. So please welcome my friend, Lars Brink. Lars is a tech speaker, a tech writer, open source contributor. He works at System8 in Denmark and is a Microsoft MVP. So hi Lars, and welcome to our very first NG Meetup Yerevan.
Hello Armen, hello community. I see lots of people showing up in the chat. Nice to see you. Thank you all for joining. This is my first time virtually in Armenia. I hope to go there someday in person.
Yeah,
right?
Barbecue is already on the fire.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Armen. I'm happy. I have prepared a special talk, Angular talk, just for this occasion.
Yeah, I've heard about that talk a lot, and I'm really looking forward to listening you present that. It's about Angular Ivy, right?
Yeah, it's actually, I'm writing a book about Angular Ivy. It's close to done, so it'll be out in maybe 1 or 2 months. And I listed the various topics to you, and you selected 2 of your favorite ones. So I created a talk based on that. That's what we're going to see today.
Sounds really good. To be honest, I hated transitioning to Ivy because it came with so many bugs and so many issues that I still experience some not very pleasant moments. But I enjoyed the reduced bundle size. I enjoyed the arguable performance boost that it had. It was very good for my it was very good for my web components. You remember the whole nightmare that I was.
Oh, you and your web components, yeah.
Yeah, me and my web component. I'm the only developer that uses the web components. At this point, they just maintain it for me and our project.
Yeah. Google is maintaining Angular elements just for you, right?
Yeah, of course, definitely.
Yeah, I look forward to your talk. It's on RxJS, right? And we have a final session after the 2 talks. Is that right?
Yes, as we've talked about it, let's introduce our viewers to a bit about our agenda. So, as I've mentioned, I have a talk and Lars has a talk. So, my talk will be about RxJS in Angular. As I said, and as Lars presented, he will talk about Angular Ivy. I believe it was called Confidence in Templates and Styles.
Yeah.
So I'm going to be confident after this call, after this presentation, finally. And after that comes the most interesting live part, is that we, together with Lars, are going to discuss technical writing, contributions to our open source communities and open source contributions in general. So during the event, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them in the live chat on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. I see all of the comments here. Thanks for joining again. I see lots of people greeting us, and that's really nice. Thanks for joining. And if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to submit them, and we will do our best to try to answer as many of them as we can. When
are we going to answer?
When we are going to answer is, of course, after we finish the presentations. We will gloss over the questions and see which one we can answer in the somewhat limited time that we have. But we, of course, will try to cover as many as we can.
Nice.
And of course, when we will have our final discussion, again, feel free to submit questions during that final discussion. And again, we will try to answer at least some of them.
Very good. Thank you for that nice introduction, Armen.
You're welcome. So I guess we can get started with the actual presentations. So as I mentioned, I will be presenting the first presentation. So let me tell you a bit about what we are going to do. The presentation is called RxJS in Angular, so it's a pretty telling name. Of course, everyone that is using Angular has had at least some experience with RxJS. But during my time working on different projects, I realized that lots of people have really limited experience with it. Lots of code that we encounter in the world that uses Angular doesn't really use RxJS to an extent that is really desirable. I have talked about this a lot. I have written several articles. I have articles titled in the same way, like RxJS in Angular, part 1, 2, and 3. I also have been a guest on the Angular Adventures in Angular podcast, where we talked about RxJS and its usage in Angular. So why am I doing this? Why am I talking about RxJS so much? Is because, first of all, I love RxJS. I really enjoy working with it, and I believe lots of Angular developers will benefit from using it. So today's presentation is really small one, but that is because we were actually going to do some live coding. The idea of it being that I will present a project that is a bit ridden with some bad practices that can be fixed with RxJS. And we will just purely live code and change that component, Angular component, to use RxJS in ways that becomes a more neat, a more beautifully written Angular component. Okay, so let's get started with the presentation. So Here you can see an Angular project. It's a really small project, and it's actually a registration page, but a bit sophisticated one that can really benefit from using ArcGIS. So this is the project that we are going to work on. But before we get started with changing any code here, please, we have to understand how exactly ArcGIS should be applied, and if we have an application that doesn't really use lots of ArcGIS, how should we proceed, what steps should we take so that the transition is not painful. So here, let's talk about ArcGIS in Angular. So what about ArcGIS? Why do we want to use ArcGIS? Well, first of all, we are going to use ArcGIS to avoid imperative code. And we're going to talk a bit about what imperative code is and why it's bad in a while. And our aim is to address issues with applications that already exist, that are large code bases that don't really use ArcGIS a lot. So we are kind of converting existing applications to use ArcGIS. Of course, when we're starting using ArcGIS, we can fall for different bad practices as with any framework or library. So we're also going to briefly cover some bad practices and how to avoid them. And also, we will try to learn how to recognize patterns of development that help us understand when to use ArcGIS and when not to. Because, again, ArcGIS is great, but it's not a silver bullet. Not every problem in the world should be fixed with ArcGIS. And, of course, sometimes ArcGIS can be abused, misused, or just applied in a wrong place. So that is what we are going to do with this presentation. So this is what we are going to do with this live coding project. So as I mentioned, we want to use ArcGIS. So let's understand what happens when we don't use ArcGIS. So not using ArcGIS comes with different downsides. Well, first of all, it's of course imperative code. And when I say imperative code, some people might not know what exactly imperative code is or have heard about concepts like imperative code, declarative code, and stuff like that. Of course, I'm going to show examples of imperative code and how to change that. But briefly speaking, imperative code is the code that tells the computer how to do something. And the opposite of that is the declarative code that tells the computer what to do without explicitly explaining. So wrapping our codes in functions with meaningful names and combining them is a really great way to increase the, let's say, declarativeness of our code. And of course, ArcGIS comes with a set of operators that are really explicit, like map, filter, and stuff, and all these operators like that. So using those operators allows us to create new observables that are really look very declarative. So we can just take a look at an observable with all the piped operators and immediately understand what exactly that does without having to dive into the implementation details. So that is why. So that is the downside of not using ArcGIS. We get stuck with imperative code a lot, especially because Angular is using lots of object-oriented programming, which really comes with like imperative notions of using methods to describe stuff that is going to work with the application state and so on. So not using ArcGIS, yeah, we might get stuck with imperative code. Then it comes bugs that are hard to fix, and I'm going to show in the live coding example a method that can come with a bug. And when we have bugs in imperative codes and when we have methods that call other methods and stuff like that, we might encounter bugs that are hard to fix, hard to find, and we might spend lots of times trying to fix those bugs. So ArcGIS is a more natural solution to that problem, and bugs in ArcGIS oftentimes are way easier to locate and way easier to find. And again, we're going to see that in our code examples. Then we have, of course, tightly coupled code. Not much that we can say about that. Obviously, when we have components with lots of methods and different methods call other methods, we already might have some coupling between all of those different pieces of our classes. So RxJS gets rid of that by not using methods at all. We don't use methods. We use observables, which are essentially just data structures. So they're stored in properties. So we're not working with methods. And in ideal situation, we're not subscribing to observables. So no problem with that either. Of course, when we have lots of methods, we have lots of code in our components. So components become really bloated. We have different methods that explain how to do different things in a way that might make our components larger. And of course, sometimes when we have exotic problems, like problems that we don't really encounter on a daily basis, we might be stuck with a big chunk of code that solves that problem in a really sophisticated way. So we would also have to kind of write a several line comments to describe how this code works and why is it here in the first place and so on. But of course, as we'll see, RxJS provides some ways of solving these kinds of problems. So those are the downsides of not using RxJS, and probably people that have worked on, let's say, mixed projects might be raising their hands. Oh yeah, that's me. I've experienced something like that. I have seen a project that has lots of imperative codes, but I also know that there are pieces that are written in a more declarative way using RxJS, so it's really painful. So, of course, these are all the negative sides of not using RxJS. So let's talk about upsides of using RxJS. So first of all, obviously declarative code. Observables are just that. They're data structures with streams. They describe exactly what they are, what data they do represent, what data type they do have. And we don't need methods and imperative code to describe how they work. We just combine RxJS operators to get a result. Okay. Of course, bugs are easier to identify and fix. They're easier to find because when we have a source of data that is a stream, if there is a bug, it's in that property. It's not connected to anything else. We cannot modify an observable from another environment. If I have an observable as a property on my component, it will only emit the values that come through that stream. Any other method, any other property in my component cannot affect that stream, cannot affect that observable value. So any bugs that I have come exactly from that observable. So obviously it would be easier to identify. Code becomes easier to navigate through. Again, properties are better than methods. So there is that. And of course, decoupling, again, because two different observables cannot really affect each other unless we specifically use some operators to combine them. So obviously, two different observables, they are as decoupled as you can get. So no problem with modifying one observable and being scared that we might break something and so on. And of course, shorter components, as I said, more properties, less methods. Stuff like that is really nice on the eye. And again, exotic problems can have exotic solutions. I'm going to show one example. And we will see that sometimes problems that imperatively are really sophisticated to solve can be solved in just several lines of RxJS code. So those are the upsides of using RxJS. And of course, when we start converting our showcase application, we will see that we will get exactly those upsides. Okay. So let's understand how we are moving from imperative code to declarative code. So there are 4 different steps. And of course, the first step is to identify the problem, identify where the imperative code is. First of all, obviously, of course, we will have to read the code. But we'll have to read it really carefully to identify the parts that are written in an imperative way. And we will have to find sources of data, meaning that we will have to understand how exactly the application state, the component state is affecting the UI, and make that state an observable stream. That will come in the next step. So before we do that, let's start with the first step and try to get used to this component, which is fairly large. It's 101 line of code. Of course, there's a commented thing that I'm going to show. This is the solution to an exotic problem. But before we see that, let's see what exactly this component does. It's not something really complicated. It's not something really complicated. It's a registration page for. You see, we have a problem here. So here we have this screen that somehow keeps popping up. Sorry for this. Let's just comment this code so that we don't have this bug here. So we have a registration screen that is interconnected in a way that values that we input in different components affect whether we can submit the form. And also it is a government service for getting a driver's license. So of course, as any government organization, it doesn't really work after 7 p.m. So here we have a function that calculates the working hours so that the form cannot be submitted after 7 p.m. and before 9 a.m. And of course, all of this is done in a really, really imperative way. And here are lots of checkings that are done while subscribing to the value changes observable in our component. Which is kind of a bad practice. We don't really like subscribing to the value changes observable unless we really only need to perform a imperative operation that cannot be done in any other way. And again, we have a very simple template, just forms that are bound to form controls here using form control name directives, and a submit button that is looking for an is disabled Boolean and is not working hour. And if you are thinking, well, this doesn't look really good, you're right, we're going to change this. So let's see how all of this works here. Let's identify the problems. Well, first of all, we have this property is disabled. And we have this big chunk of code that checks for different things. It tries to see in which country the user is located. And if the user is located in Armenia, we apply driver license laws based on the driver license type that the user selected. Like if it's a D-type driver's license, you have to be at least 19 years old. And if it's an E-type driver's license, you have to be at least 21 years old, and so on. So it's a really ugly chunk of code. I really don't want to see this code for more than 1 minute, so I'm going to scroll away. We have a function that calculates the working hours, and we have an interval that calls this function every 10 seconds. This is a bit arbitrary, but I guess that's fine. But the thing is that my ng-on-init function is really huge. It's like really, really big, even without this commented code. And the third feature that we have here is displaying an inactive pop-up, which is a feature that if we have the user not doing anything on the page, we have to show a pop-up, and that was the pop-up that we had a bug on. Okay, so let's get starting on a third point of this first chapter. It's finding the sources of data. So if we want to modify this component, if we want to make it better, we need to get rid of all this imperative code. So how do we do that? So we have a is disabled Boolean, but instead of that, we are going to have an is disabled observable. Let's just create it and have it here so that we can modify it. And let's realize how this is disabled Boolean is working. It is only connected to the function here, to this callback to the subscribe function. Here comes lots of logic. I don't really like that logic, but let's just copy this, okay, and try to get rid of this subscription, okay. So I can do something like this. Use the map operator, take the value, and here we go. Of course, I need to move this form property before I can declare this one. Let's do something like this. Okay. So again, it's the same thing, but we're not subscribing to the observable anymore. So if I close this, so if I delete this, this won't work. The is disabled Boolean won't be working anymore. And because it's true by default, it will be disabled even if I submit all the fields with normal name. Say something like this. I have submitted all the inputs, but it's not working. So here I'm going to get rid of this is disabled property for good, and use the map operator to just return the values. Again, as the map operator is working, it takes the value of our form from the value changes observable, and using this function, it converts it to whatever this callback returns. So if the user is smaller than 18 years old, it will return true, it will be disabled. So now I have an observable of all these values. I have an observable of all these values, and I can use it in my template using the async pipe. Okay, I can do something like this. I have an is disabled observable here. Sometimes there are different conventions of writing. Sometimes people put equals true when using the async pipe. I prefer only to do that with if equals false, but again, I only need the equals true, so we'll keep it to this in this way. So here, what I have changed is I don't have any logic in my ng-on-it function method related to that disabling logic. I only have a property that comes with a map operator that transforms my initial source of values, the form, to the actual Boolean value that is going to be used in a template. So this is the continuation of what I've been saying about the steps to convert the application code. So we have seen how to identify the imperative code, and we have also, of course, moved on a bit on to the next step. We have used one operator. We have used the map operator. And we have identified the source of the data and how it is modified. So in our case, we took an imperative piece of code, we transformed it a bit and using an RxJS operator, and then we turned it into a source of data for our stream, and then used it in the template using the async pipe. So that's the next step. So we learn RxJS operators. Of course, we know some of them. I guess lots of people on our stream now are familiar with the map operators. So that's, I started with the simplest one. I guess it's probably the most popular operator in RxJS because it really reflects what RxJS is doing, it mapping data using the stream. So when doing all of this, we are turning to the step of changing the code. Of course, we use operators to modify the stream. And as we have done, we move sources of data to properties. So this is what we will do. We translate imperative logic to declarative. We only have properties after that. We only have properties that are observable strings that incorporate the logic inside them using operators. And of course, the very last step is using the async pipe to display the data and removing the imperative methods, as I've shown in the example. Of course, the async pipe becomes very important for us when using RxJS a lot because we really don't want to subscribe to observables. When I was talking about some bad practices, again, subscribing to observables isn't really a bad practice, but it's something not really desirable. Like, we don't want to invite developers to write any imperative code. And when we write .subscribe and a callback, well, that callback is a kind of an invitation to, yeah, here is the value from the stream, do anything with it. You can write even imperative code. That's not really what we want. We want a stream that takes this data, transforms it, and is stored as a data structure that I can apply to the async pipe. So those are the steps. So those are the 4 steps, and we're going to continue to apply them to our component. Identify problematic code, identify imperative code that we have, apply RxJS operator to the source of the data, then move the sources to properties, as we have done with the isDisabled Boolean, and use operators to modify the stream if necessary, and of course, use the async pipe to display the data and remove the imperative methods. So let's return to our component. Let's see what other problems here we have. We have this really not ugly but not pleasant method called calculate not working hours, which is called using a set interval function, and it's really an imperative function too. It calculates the current date, gets the hours, and does some checking and applies it to the state. So we have really a bunch of problems here. We have a stateful property that is being modified from another method that is being called from another method using a callback. So it's 5 lines of code, but it's really not the best code that we can hope for. So what I really need is an observable of a Boolean observable that is going to depend on, let me just copy this piece of code. So we are going to have an observable. The source of our data is the current time. So I'm going to use the interval function from RxJS to get a stream of current date objects. I'm going to map it to a Boolean value. So first of all, let's take the current date. I'm going to apply the map operator twice, so it's really like visible how the stream is changing through different emissions. So on every emission, we are going to take the current date. Then we are going again to map that current date to this value here. Sorry. So what we have here is an observable that emits every 10 seconds. Every time it emits, we read the current date, and then we check if the current date is during working hours. And this is mapped to a Boolean value, so it's either true or false. So we can remove this now. We don't need the imperative type. We don't need this method. We're not going to call it anymore, and we're going to remove this too here. So we have a really nice and shiny property here. And the good thing about it is that if I experience any problems, if I have any bugs related to this, then there is no other option other than that bug being located somewhere here. In our last case, I could have a bug here. I could have a bug in the method that I removed, and that would really require me to look through more methods. I don't need to look for any methods using this. So again, in my template, I'm just going to modify this a bit and use the async pipe. See if in this input would be disabled if it's using this is disabled thing and is not working our thing. So we can go forward. We can go forward with this, and actually we can even combine those two streams, so I don't have to write something like that. I can use the combine latest operator, or rather function. I can change this name to is not valid. I'm checking for the exact validity of the form, and I'm checking the interval, so I can combine those two observables into an is disabled observable. This combine latest. I guess is not valid is not really a smart name. You can change it to is invalid. So here I can use the is invalid stream, combine it with the is not working hours stream, and map it to their combined value. If either of them are false, if either of them are true, the control must be disabled. Actually, two booleans. Here we go. What I've done is I have separated the logic for the validity of the form and the checking for working hour times. And then I combined those two streams and mapped it to a combined result of those two. Again, it's really nice in the way that when I have different observables, if at some point in my application or my component, I need to do something with two different observables, I can finish it using combine latest. I don't need to subscribe to observables and wait for something to happen and stuff like that. I can use operators and functions like combine latest. Of course, there are lots of other options too, like with latest from, concat latest from, and stuff like that. But in our case, of course, using combine latest operator is the best solution. So we have got rid of those pieces of code. So the final thing that we need is this exotic problem that I was talking about, the inactive pop-up thing. So what we have done here is we listen to these events. Okay, click, mouse move, key down, and scroll. We just decided that these are events that indicate that the user is still active. And we listen to those events and reset the inactive pop-up timer. And here we have this sophisticated really logic. We check for if the pop-up is open. If it's not open, we open it and set a timeout. We wait for the timeout and we clear the timeout if some of these events have happened. So if the user has clicked something, so again, we are waiting another 5 seconds. And if no events happen, then we display the pop-up. And here we had a bug, as you can remember. So how do I do this using RxJS? Actually, this example is noteworthy because I once made a tweet that contained this code without this checking, but still it was this simple. So what I do with RxJS, I don't need all of this logic. I really don't need all of this imperative code. I just try to listen to all of those events using the from event observable creator function. What I do is I take all these events, I have them in this constant here, so I can change the name to events. So if I have these events here, I subscribe to all of them, kind of using the merge operator. So if any of these events happen, I will receive a notification. Then I don't need to tap it at all. Then I use this buffer when operator, which is an interesting thing that uses another observable as a notifier. In our case, an interval of 3 seconds. Or 10 seconds or anything as we need. If we want to open a pop-up in 10 seconds, we can just change it to 10 seconds. So it uses this interval to kind of collect all the events that have happened during that interval. Okay, so buffer when takes this notifier observable and collects events from different sources, in our case from all of those events. So if any events happen, I will receive an array that contains the objects that represent those events. And here comes the catch. It's that if the array is empty, that means that the user didn't perform any events in the last 10 seconds. So I can just check for the length and check if the pop-up is not already open. Then I can open the pop-up and turn the inactive pop-up open value to true so that it doesn't keep doing this thing at all. So again, I have very minor piece of imperative code here. I only work with the state here to know if the pop-up is open. I don't need all of this. I don't need to perform all of these calculations. Actually, buffer when does that for me, everything that is done here, and it's really understandable how it works. So I remove this method. I remove all of this stuff. So the only thing that is left in my ng-unit function is a service call that loads the list of countries. You can just ignore this, and the subscription to this observable that opens the pop-up. So here we had an exotic problem, and we got an exotic solution for that using a more obscure RxJS operator. Of course, there are hundreds of RxJS operators, and I would really advise anyone interested in RxJS to open the API reference and try to get as familiar with different operators as possible. But of course, knowing all of them is not really what we want to achieve. So those are the 4 steps of converting our code. So we use that to make our component really really small and concise. So in conclusion, 𝗪𝗔𝗔 helps us to improve our code. It makes our code more reasonable, and it really shows that we can solve more complicated problems without the apprehension of getting some bugs that really can be difficult to fix. And of course, the good thing is 𝗪𝗔𝗔 is a library, so it's optional to use in our code. Again, we don't need to convert our entire application to start using that 𝗪𝗔𝗔 code. But it's important to understanding also in the whole Angular ecosystem, because lots of different libraries make heavy use of 𝗪𝗔𝗔, especially state management tools like NGRX. And of course, for every problem, as we see, there might be an operator that fixes it in a way more easier pattern, like which you would expect. Sometimes problems that sound really challenging can be solved easier in a way using 𝗪𝗔𝗔 operators. So this is our presentation, and let's see if we have questions about the presentation.
Hey, Armen.
Oh, hi, Lars.
Thank you for your presentation. So now we all know your secret, Armen's 4 steps to declarative code.
Let's see what questions we have. Arsen is asking about, I see a question.
Let me read it for you, then you can answer.
Okay.
This is from Armin. I'm interested in knowing, is it a good practice to mention public or private access modifiers when declaring properties?
Well, surely we would have to use the private keyword, of course, if we want the property to be private. But I hate writing the keyword public, so I always, if it has no keywords, then it's a public property. People, this is not C#. Stop with that nonsense.
So what's your team standard for this?
No, we don't use the public keywords.
Do you use listing tools for automating this rule?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay. I saw another good question, and I'm hoping you can bring it up on the screen.
Which one? Yeah.
This is from Arsen. Is there any way to avoid multiple async pipes when subscribing to the same property? For example, what can we do if we have the case of disabling multiple buttons with the isDisabled observable using async pipe?
Yeah, we can use the ngIf trick. Of course, it's not really useful in our case, because if we use ngIf with the Boolean observable, it will just hide all the templates inside. But if it's another observable that we are subscribing to a lot, then we can use the isDisabled async as something, declare a local variable, and then use it inside that template. We can use ng containers to avoid introducing new HTML elements for that. And of course, there's another nice tool that I really like from NGRX. It's still a bit experimental, the NGRX let directive. Have you heard about it, Lars?
Yeah, but I'm using the RX Angular package, the template package from RX Angular. It also has a let directive. So I'm team RX Angular for that one.
Yeah, that's also a more generic solution for people that are not using NGRX, I guess. I use NGRX on all my projects, so I just stick with the NGRX let directive.
Yeah, but it's still experimental, that package, NGRX component. But so is Rx Angular template right now. It's still an alpha version, so you can't get anything stable.
Well, I just hope that NGRX will just go forward with that NGRX component thing, and we'll just get the NGRX push and the NGRX let directives.
Let's hope so. The code is pretty simple, but yeah, there's things to consider before including it in your library. Okay. There was a comment from Elise. Maybe we can bring that up from this on the screen. So you, another comment, not this comment from Elise.
The
earlier one probably about reactive.
Yeah, the one before that. Yeah, this one.
Yes. So she's saying that you are moving the reactivity from the action of reassigning properties into a stream of data, so emitting those values instead. Is that approach you use often?
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put that, in the sense that we are moving away from assigning values to properties to just having an initial property that is mapped to something else using operators and stuff like that. So it sounds really nice. So Elise, please make a tweet so I can retweet that.
Yeah. So you're moving away from, if you're storing those values in the property of the component, then you have shared mutable state. But when you're inside of this function scope, then it's a local state, and it's no problem mutating it, or you were even just returning a value, so there was no variable being reassigned.
Yeah, that's a really good point about how it changes our code.
Mm-hmm. So Armen, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Because I don't see more right now in the chat, so I have a question. How do you work reactively with Angular reactive forms?
Can we skip that question?
Okay, I have another one.
Okay.
How would you test that registration form you just showed?
How would I test that? I would take the properties that I have, which are publicly exposed, and I have the form instance, the form group instance. So I can just use set values and see how, and subscribe to the observable and expect different values. So that would be really simple, I guess. And again, returning to the reactive form stuff, yeah, I would subscribe to the observable. Obviously, I can't do something really nice using imperative functions like set value and patch value and disable, enable, and all other methods like that. But that's really kind of an exception to the rule of not subscribing to observables. So in general, I suggest that people don't subscribe to observables unless you use some other third-party code that is written in an imperative way and you cannot change that, like the reactive forms. So that's kind of the exception, because you cannot do it in another way unless until the times when Angular allows us to sort of plug observables into form groups and stuff.
Okay, nice answer. What's the worst example of RxJS abuse?
What's the worst example? Yeah, I would say doing everything through subjects and not using a state management system, but also not really using RxJS operators with those subjects to at least make the code readable. Like you would, I've seen a code base where people would create lots of subjects for every value that needs to be shared between components and would just net something from here, subscribe there, and use imperative code, lots of codes in the subscribe, and never use operators. So that's really a horrible way to also make all those components interconnected. So it's really hard to refactor after that.
And I guess if you're sticking with using observables as a value container for shared state between components, I strongly suggest you use a state management system. If you don't like Redux, you can now use NGRX component store, which you are such a big fan of. It's really simple. It's kind of a really sophisticated but simple API for a subject service with the subject concept. It's really nice. It has everything. It's kind of everything that the big NGRX store has, but it's very simple to grasp and use with different components and plug shared state between them. So I guess if you are doing something like what I mentioned, you better just stick with something like NGRX component store.
Yeah, that's once you go component store, you never go back. So do you know why I like the component store?
You don't like Redux?
No. It's an Angular related answer. It has to do with Angular.
It's using object-oriented programming.
No, so your mission is to eliminate all imperative code. I have another mission, and it's also about eliminating something.
You want to eliminate all code?
No. I want to eliminate ng modules. Yeah. And
that's what everyone wants.
Component store, no modules needed. No actions needed either, but the most important thing, no ng modules needed.
Yeah, that's really nice. You can just provide it in the component, but still, it's not a solution. We still have to use modules because for reasons unknown.
Not because of state management, at least. So that's pretty nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So, there's a quote. Maybe we can get your quote from Elise. It's in the YouTube chat. You can say it for us, Armen.
Yeah, if an application is big enough for Angular, then it's big enough for NGRX, and that's what I'm sticking to.
Yeah, that's your quote.
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up. So, about quotes, are you ready to talk about Angular Ivy?
I am very ready, and this will be good for you, Armen, because you were only mostly annoyed with Ivy from your upgrade experience. So let me tell you about some nice improvements to the developer experience because of Angular Ivy. You ready for this?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll see you afterwards for the Q&A. Right, so this talk is about two topics from my upcoming Angular Ivy book. It's about strict template type checking and about style binding evaluation. And if you don't like the topics, you can blame Armen because he picked them. First one is about style binding evaluation, because this has changed significantly between View Engine and Angular Ivy, which was finally introduced as a stable version in version 9 of Angular, and today we're on version 12. So you might know that there are many different ways of binding styles and classes in Angular. And when we're using Ivy, this is the precedence rule, so the prioritization, because if there are multiple bindings on the same element, Angular will decide only one value between all those bindings for every property, that is. It will, of course, merge multiple bindings with the same binding, for example, with template map bindings. So for each of these, we will see an example of what that looks like. But what's worth keeping in mind is the higher up the list, the more priority they will have. They will have a higher precedence. So the higher rules will override the lower rules when applied to the same element. So first up, we have a simple template property binding, but this actually has the highest precedence, so the highest priority of all the bindings that we listed. So this element will, of course, be 𝗪𝗵𝗁 after Eric Meyer's daughter, who unfortunately passed away. Next one is the template map binding. So we pass an object that can have multiple properties. In this case, it only has the background property, also bound to 𝗪𝗵𝗁 for this div element. So this is the second priority, or the second highest precedence for Angular Ivy style binding evaluation. Next up is static template style value, and we can use the same for classes. This is how we would normally, if we're not doing best practice, we might have a lot of these inline styles in our HTML, and Angular also has rules for how to evaluate these according to other bindings when used in a component template, right? So it has lower priorities than the ones we just saw, the property template binding and the map binding in the template, but it has higher priority than the following bindings, like this one, the directive host property binding. So we might create a directive that has some host bindings so that when it's applied to an element, it will bind, for example, here, the background color of that element, given that there are no bindings with a higher priority or precedence. So next up in the precedence rule set is the directive host map binding. So this is similar to the one we just saw, but it's binding an object with several properties, in this case only the background property. After directive host map bindings, we have the static host style bindings, and we can use the same for classes, HTML classes. It looks like so. So it's a style binding with a string that says background 𝗪𝗵𝗁𝗁𝗃. Finally, we get to the component bindings. We have component host property bindings. So when an element is bound to a component, it can control its style bindings using host metadata like so. And we can also bind a map as seen here. And finally, we can have some static style bindings in the component as well. So no rules without exceptions. So Angular has these built in, or in the common package, they have these two directives, ngClass and ngStyle. You might know them. And they actually override every single one of the regular bindings that are part of the templating language. So that, as we can see here, ngStyle is overriding a template map binding, even though it's one of the highest priorities or precedences. So instead of being purple, this element will become red because of the ngStyle binding. Every time the view is updated, it will override whatever is bound to that element. So this is like the bang important keyword in CSS, ngClass and ngStyle, if you want to override everything else. There's another thing to be aware of with style bindings in Ivy, knowledge values. So in this case, we are binding to this property binding. We're binding the null value, and that will cancel out the template map binding we also have, so that this element will have no background color. But if we instead bind the undefined value, it's skipping this template or this style binding. So style background will be ignored when assigning or binding the undefined value. Also, if it's in a variable instead of a literal value as here. So undefined will skip this binding and go to the lower priorities. How about ordering? Well, it turns out that ordering the style bindings does not affect the style evaluation. That was not true in View Engine. The ordering did matter, but no one knew which order was the right one. So here we see the template property binding versus the template map binding, and the property binding has the highest priority, so it wins. Even if we switch around the order, the element is still blue, right? So ordering does not matter. Having said that, it does matter if you have several bindings with the same precedence. The last one wins. So now let's add another template property binding, and the element turns red. Last style binding with the same precedence wins. So because the red is after the blue, the element will be red. I hope that makes sense. If not, let's look at a demo. It's here in StackBlitz. And you'll get the link as well in the YouTube description, or you can copy it here, right? I'll also be tweeting it out afterwards. So here's the demo. Spoiler alert. So we have an app component. It has just one element in its template, and it has many different style bindings. First one up here is the ng style binding. This is the caveat, right? We have a template property binding, a template map binding, and a static style binding in the template. And then we see that we also have a directive applied here. We're finding it down here, and it also has a host property binding and a static host style binding. We also notice that this is actually a component in the template of app component. So locating that, we see that it also has multiple style bindings. So it has a property host binding in the component, and it has a static style binding in the component. So my question is now, which color is this element? And you may or may not be surprised that it's the crimson color, because remember, the ng style binding is like the bang important keyword in CSS, so it overrides everything else. Even if we switch the order of the style bindings, it will still remain this one. But if we remove this one, what will be the remaining value of the background color? Well, it's the template property binding. So now we have hot pink, and also switching around the order, we see that it's still hot pink. Removing that, and now we have the property map binding in the template. Now we have the coral color as the background. Removing that, and we'll see that now it's the static style binding in the template. We have a gold background color now. And with all of those removed, we're left with just this component, app host style, and the host style directive. And I wonder which one is winning now, which style binding. And we can see that we have the purple color. So it is indeed this host property binding for the style in this directive. Removing that, and now we should see the olive green. So this is a static style binding in the, or static host style binding in the directive. If that's removed, now we have nothing left from the directive, so we could even remove that, and it shouldn't change. So now we're left with the component, and let's see which style bindings again are in the component. We have a property, host property binding in the component. So we have navy blue, and removing that, we're left with the tan color. This is a static host style binding in a component, which has one of the lowest precedences in Angular Ivy. Removing that, and we have no background color. And since the text is white, everything has disappeared. So I'm hoping that this gives you an insight into the style binding evaluation in Angular Ivy, because Angular has to decide which value is left with all these different style bindings that we have at our disposal. That's everything about style bindings. Now let's move on to strict template type checking. You might already be familiar with this, but we are looking into detail about all the settings. First, let's see how we enable it. If we are generating a new workspace using Angular CLI 12, it will be strict by default. In versions, the recent versions, at least the Ivy versions, I think, you could add the --strict flag when saying ng new workspace or when generating a new application, and we would get these strict options as well. But we have these three we have to take care of. Make sure to also add the strict setting for the TypeScript compiler, because that also affects the Angular compiler, and in this case, the strict template type checking. So we have two options. We have the strict templates we need to set to true, or make sure it is. And we have additionally the strict input access modifiers. And the one above that, the strict injection parameters, is not related to components or templates. Well, it also affects components, but has nothing to do with data binding and templates. So that's a separate topic. So the strict templates setting is actually shorthand for these 9 different settings, one of which is the strict literal types marked with an asterisk, because that was also enabled earlier in View Engine if we enable full template type checking mode, as opposed to the first version, which was called basic template type checking. And additionally, we have the setting strict input access modifiers. It has to be enabled separately, as we saw before. Looking at the first one called strict attribute types, if we have the Angular language service enabled in our editor, for example, Visual Studio Code, this is what we will see in our template. We will see a squiggly red line because we have the counter component, and it has an input property expecting a number. But in the component using it in its template, we are actually assigning a string because we forgot to add the property binding, the square brackets. And when binding as an attribute, an HTML element attribute, we are actually passing a string instead. If we compile this project now, we will get the error message. We'll also get that in our editor inline if we hover over the error. But when compiling with the strict template type checking enabled, we will see an error similar to this. Type string is not assignable to type of number with the column, the file name and the column and line number. And even down to, so this HTML template file was loaded into this app component TS file, and the error occurs in the template of the component named app component. So a very nice descriptive message, something that has also improved a lot in Angular Ivy. And this also applies to strict template type checking. Next one is called strict context generics. This is an advanced one. So take a look at this component class, the user list component. It has a generic type parameter of tuser, which as a minimum extends the user interface we have in the button. So our input property is an array, or actually a read-only array of TUsers. And now if we add a template to this component, and we loop over this array of users with the ng4 directive, the user list component will be what's known as the context component as far as the ng4 structural directive is concerned. And with View Engine, it was not possible to get that type parameter, that generic parameter called tuser here. It was not possible to type check that. So we wouldn't get this red squiggly line in View Engine. But with Ivy, of course, we do get it now. And this is the error produced by the compiler. The property ID does not exist on the type tuser. So a very descriptive message. It's highlighted exactly where this binding is in the template, in the component template, and which component is using this template, the user list component. Next setting is the strict DOM event types. So this $event object, the special one, is type checked for the native DOM event bindings in component templates. So here we are binding to the click event. We're passing this $event object into our event listener called onClick, and it's expecting an input event. So what might be wrong here? Let's look at the error message when compiling. Argument of type mouse event is not assignable to parameter of type input event. So we were, when binding to a click event, you're getting a mouse event, but our event handler is expecting the input event. So something's wrong here. We don't know which one, but we'll have to figure out, right? Now we know exactly where in the template and which component has the issue. There's one here called strict DOM local ref types. So we have this user control template reference variable. It's referring to the input element, the HTML input element. And in the button next to it, we have a click event handler inline, and we're assigning the user control that rows to 4, but we're getting an error, an unexpected error here. So what might be wrong? If we hover over this error in our editor, we'll get this message that we also get when compiling our project. So it's saying property of rows does not exist on the type HTML input element. And it's probably because this element was previously a text area, which does have the rows property on it. So now with an input element, we are unable to assign to the rows property. This is another example of something that was not possible. Well, everything here, almost everything here, is something that was not possible with Vue Engine. So thanks to Ivy, we have this improved developer experience with everything that's going on in our templates. Strict input access modifiers. This is the additional one that we have to enable in addition to the strict template setting. So it's not part of the strict template setting, but it still has to do with data binding in a template. So we have this read-only counter component. It has an input property, but it's marked as read-only. So when we bind to this property in another component's template, we are getting this error. And you might have guessed why, that we cannot assign to count because it is a read-only property. So going back, we see the problem is that we have marked it as read-only. So Angular is unable to assign a new value if respecting the TypeScript access modifier here. So this strict input access modifiers will prevent us from data binding to an input property marked with private, protected, or read-only. So we have to keep it public. Strict input types. This does so that the input property bindings are type checked. So here we have the input property named message, and it's expecting a string. But in the template, there's an issue here. We are using property binding syntax. And because of that, the value we are passing is actually a number rather than a string. And this is what the compiler will tell us. Number is not assignable to type string. Strict literal types were also available in full template type checking mode that was available in Vue Engine, but I'm listing it here for clarity anyways. So this will enable array and object literals to be type checked. And here we have an example of actually two object literals. One of them is passed to the address property, but something's wrong here. This is a user object. I wonder what might be wrong. Well, if we look at the interfaces, the address property on the user is an object itself, and it has a required property of city, which is exactly what will be displayed in the error message. The property city is missing in the type of empty object literal, but it is required in the type of address, this interface we have. So very nice error message again. I'm sure this will help us locate the error. This was the only thing that was of all of this that wasn't possible in Vue Engine with full template type checking mode. But when enabling strict templates, it's also enabled implicitly. This one is called the strict null input types, and it's about nullishness. So it's very similar to TypeScript setting called strict null check. So here we have a binding to the user's input property of this user list component. We are binding a user's $observable, and it has, we're emitting this array of user object. It's the three gentlemen of NG workers, Nacho, Santosh, and Serkan. Shout out to them. But something's wrong here. We're passing it through the async pipe, and I wonder what is wrong. So the type of read-only array of users, or null, is not assignable to the type read-only user. So our component user list is expecting a read-only array of users, but here's the issue. The async pipe is initially emitting a null value, and that's something we need to take care of when using strict template type checking. And we'll actually discuss that in a minute after all these settings of how we can deal with that issue. This one is called the strict output event types. The $event value is type checked for custom events and animation bindings. So custom events is the output properties of Angular components. So it's usually an event emitter, or we might even use just an observable. That's perfectly fine as far as Angular is concerned. So what is the issue here? We are binding to this count change event from the read-only counter. We are passing on this $event value into our event handler called onCountChange, which is expecting a string. And I wonder what the error is here. It's not really easy to see just based on this template and our component model. But Angular will tell us that number is not assignable to a parameter of type string. So our event handler was expecting a string, but the event count change is actually emitting a number. So this is a compilation error when we're using the strict output event types option. This one, strict safe navigation types, it's about time because the Elvis operator, the safe navigation operator in templates, has been available since Angular version 2. And well, it was introduced into TypeScript and ECMAScript in version 3.x of TypeScript, and I don't remember which version of ECMAScript, but within the past 2 years or so. So the result of a safe navigation is actually the undefined value. We're using a template method here, trim. It's expecting a string value, and the username is probably a string value, but because we're using the safe navigation and safe navigation operation, we are actually exposing it to the type of undefined as well. So we get this compilation error. The type undefined is not assignable to type string. Again, a nice error message, something that is enabled by Ivy's strict template type checking. Those were all the settings, and now we're moving on to some caveats, some tips here that I'm giving you. The async pipe with strict template type checking. So the strict check of null for property bindings is important if we want to use async pipe, because it initially emits a null value except for synchronous observables. So input properties that are being bound using the async pipe must either have a type that includes null or use the concept that is known as input setter type hints, which looks like so. So say we have this input property text. It's accepting only string values, as we see in the component model, the input property text. But in another component's template, we are using this button component, and we are trying to bind a dynamic button text from an observable, passing it through the async pipe. But async pipe is initially emitting a null value, so we're getting a compilation error. So how can we deal with this issue? Well, the Angular way of doing it is this special input setter type hints. So if we add a static property on the button component, which has the name of ngAccept input type underscore the name of the input property, which is text, now we can add string or null, and the Angular compiler will accept a null value as well, even though it's not mentioned in the type of the setter, because we don't want the getter to get the null value type as well, because that will make it harder to use in our template, for example. But in the setter, it's important to take care of those null values. So in this case, we have a default text of push me on this button. Another tip here about configuring the Angular language service. It's an extension for Visual Studio Code, or at least the extension for Visual Studio Code only considers the root workspace tsconfig JSON. So we must set strict templates to true in this root TypeScript configuration. As far as this VS Code extension is concerned, we cannot disable strict template type checking on a per project basis. So we have to enable it for the whole workspace or not at all, as far as it's concerned. Of course, when using the compiler, it's aware of project-specific settings. So if you're getting this message in VS Code, you have to set strict templates to true in the root tsconfig file. So we looked at applications, but we can also enable strict template type checking if we're creating Angular libraries. We have to enable the exact same settings, but we have to do it in the project-specific file known as tsconfig.lib.json. So adding the strict option for TypeScript compilation, adding the strict input access modifiers, and the strict template shorthand for the Angular compiler in our library. This is really nice for our library consumers, because by enabling this, we make sure that they can also use strict template type checking. Here is an example repository for the code samples you saw in this section, so feel free to explore that. I think the organizers will be sending these links in the chat. They have definitely pasted it in the private chat. I hope they are also in the public chat and on YouTube and so on. If not, I will be tweeting them out afterwards. So you can go and check for yourself here. So to conclude, I think I have a few minutes left. Oh, there it is. Thank you for highlighting that. So the style binding precedence rules, the top priority or the top precedence is the template bindings, as we saw. Then comes the directive host bindings, and finally the component host bindings. And it's worth noting that the style binding ordering does not affect style evaluation. But here's all the things you also need to remember. ng-class and ng-style directives override every other bindings. It's the important keyword for Angular style binding. So use it very sparingly. Also, the knowledge values affect style evaluation, and there's a difference between null values and undefined values. If we have multiple bindings using the same precedence, the last one declared wins. For strict template type checking, we can enable it for Angular applications. We can also enable it for Angular libraries, as we just saw. We can configure it on a granular level, or we can enable just these two settings, strict templates and the strict input access modifiers, and that enables all 10 settings for our project. We need to take care when configuring the Angular language service for the editor extension, at least for Visual Studio Code. But when we have it set up all right, we will get inline notifications from the Angular language service doing the type checks. And of course, if we're building our project, we will get them as compilation errors. These are all the different strict template type checks in Ivy. We have these attribute style property bindings where we forget to use the square brackets. So we're passing strings. Those are now type checked. The same for input property bindings, including whether they are nullish, so they are null or undefined. This special one, the context component type parameters, where we had the ng4 example with a generic parameter on the component using it. We saw the array and object literals in the templates also being type checked. We even saw the Elvis operator, or as it's known in Angular, the safe navigation operator in the templates. We saw two different checks for the special $event value, one for the custom events and animation bindings, and another check for native DOM events. And we saw the template reference variables referring to DOM elements. They are also type checked. About this access modifier template checks, it prevents the private, protected, and read-only input properties from being bound in a template. We can consider runtime private members prefixed with a hash symbol instead of the private properties and methods of TypeScript, because those are actually not private at runtime. They are just compilation checks. And now we have almost stage 3 at this point, the private members. And finally, as of recent versions of TypeScript, it's finally usable also for methods using the hashtag prefix. Instead of a read-only member in our component, we can also consider just a getter with a private backing field. For the async pipe, we have to note that this setting, strict null input types, is very much like the strict null checks in TypeScript, but this is for input properties bindings. The async pipe, unfortunately, initially emits a null value, but we can address this by either adding null to our input property types or accepting null through the input setter type hints. And actually, TypeScript has just added a feature where we can use different types for the setter and the getter. So this is another possible solution as soon as Angular supports that version of TypeScript. Thank you for now. This is my Twitter handle, LazyDK. I'm Lars Brink, and now looking forward to the Q&A. And Armen, maybe you can unmute. There we go.
Yeah, I managed to say thanks for having such an interesting presentation on Angular IV, and then I realized I'm muted. So it was really interesting for me to see how many different things the Angular developers had to put into consideration while developing an engine almost from scratch.
Yeah.
And it was, I guess it was really a big challenge. So it's interesting how they got solutions for all those different sorts of challenges.
Yeah, you're right, because Angular component templates, they might look a little like HTML, but we know that the compiler compiles it into JavaScript code. Well, first to TypeScript, right? But Angular has to do some special things to enable all these checks that are normally available in TypeScript with a strict setting for the TypeScript compiler.
Yeah, that's the part that was always a bit obscure for me. I didn't really realize that the component templates are compiled to TypeScript and then compiled to JavaScript. I always, kind of coming from Angular 1, I always thought something like, yeah, there's a HTML and some bindings, but really it's not HTML and some bindings. In reality, we have functions that bootstrap pieces of template and do all the bindings while creating the UI. And that's kind of similar to the approach that React has, for example, with the JSX. The JSX kind of converts to React.createElement functions. It's a bit simpler than what we have in the compiled step. It's a bit simpler, I guess, than what we have in Angular, but again, Angular comes with a more sophisticated system of data flow, so I guess this approach is kind of warranted.
Yeah. So the Angular team has to keep up with all the different operators being introduced to ECMAScript and TypeScript, because if they want to support that in the templates, I think we saw the safe navigation operator that was introduced to Angular templates before the languages. But now we have, for example, this, that operator is called optional chaining in TypeScript and ECMAScript. But there's another one, right? What's it called? The nullish coalescing operator or something like that. I think that has recently been added to Angular component templates, but it was added a long time ago to TypeScript.
It's Angular 12.1, I guess, version. The last non-major release included also the nullish coalescing operator in the templates, which is really nice because I guess in the templates we usually deal more with variables that might not have a default value. So having a nullish coalescing operator is useful.
Yeah, we saw that when I had the trim template method, and I had this user and then $.name. But when the user is null, that value will be undefined. So I could use the nullish coalescing operator, combine it with that safe navigation operator, and then add the empty string as a default value of that expression. So those two operators go nice hand in hand, both in component templates and in TypeScript itself.
Yeah. I guess we have some comments here and questions, so I want to return the courtesy and read out the questions for you, Lars.
Thank you.
So Sahak is asking, how exactly did the Angular team decide to stick with that particular ordering of style bindings? I guess he's interested in why this ordering.
Why not? Before, maybe a few persons in the world knew, but there were a lot of caveats, even more than now. So, I mean, I don't think that the order matters as much as the fact that now we have these precedence rules and they're in the documentation. So I don't know why is one better than the other, but the way it goes is template bindings, directive bindings, component bindings. And that kind of makes sense because you can add a component in your template, then you can add some directives on top of that. And finally, in this template, you can override it using bindings that are only in this template, that are not mentioned in that component or its directive. So it kind of makes sense. And then finally, you have the ng style and ng class that just shut up directive, right?
I guess that makes sense. It's really reasonable. Also, I liked that you mentioned that finally have the ordering in the documentation. So that's a really important point because we all know that sometimes there is stuff in Angular that is not in the documentation. I guess it's really nice to have the ordering here. So we have another question from Arsen. Do reactive forms work with strict checking like attribute, context, and etc.?
Yeah, I think there's actually an issue with reactive forms. When using them in the templates, the form groups, for example, or form arrays, you cannot use the named index access. That will break the type checking. So you have to use, for example, .get and then the string of the name, which makes it even more uncomfortable to work with. So, and there's another API of the reactive forms that has the same issue. So yeah, they do work, but it puts limitations on how you can use them. So you might see some errors when enabling strict template type checking if you're using reactive forms binding to them in your template or doing some logic.
As we talked about reactive forms and new features in Angular, have you heard about the proposals for strictly typed reactive forms?
A proposal? Oh yeah,
I guess there was a PR even.
Yeah, well, the types are getting a little stricter in every version of Angular, and some of those improvements have been to some of the reactive forms APIs. I think we still have plenty, or a few of them, that still have the type of any, which is the worst possible type in TypeScript for most cases. So there are still some we still have places to go with that before we have strong type checking in reactive forms. But it has definitely been improved since version 9, so that's good.
We also have a question from Elise. Not completely in the scope, but what is the advantage of using ng-style and ng-class apart from precedence? If we combine the native style and class attributes, that's actually a question that also bothered me a lot, but I never had time to look up.
Yeah, well, I think there might have been something similar in AngularJS, so that might be one reason. But I also think that some of these style bindings were not available in the early versions of Angular. And because of that, we had to use ng-style and ng-class for some of these bindings. But now we have the same expressiveness, or even better, in some of these other, for example, all the map bindings. So now there's no reason to be using it, because you can also bind to all the other forms of style bindings. You can add data binding. But if you're in a difficult situation and you need a quick fix, you can use it. But you should be like, we should have a linting rule not to use them, right? They're a last resort for. Now you know how to evaluate the style bindings and make sense of which one applies.
I see. That's really a good point in the sense that we have these lots of options to choose from, and obviously, first of all, we need to think about consistency. So I guess we should, as you said, only use those other options as last resort. So I have another question. Actually, you have been talking about the Angular language service, and I'm using Visual Studio Code, and it just broke. And I'm not the only one that is experiencing the problem starting from, I guess, 1.43 release of Visual Studio Code. And I cannot for the life of me figure out how to enable the strict template checkings, because when I change the TS config, it still gets to. Is this some issue that Visual Studio Code has, or maybe I'm doing something wrong?
Yeah, so I definitely noted this issue of you have to enable strict templates in the root TS config in the workspace for the VS Code extension to pick up that setting. It cannot figure out on a project by project basis. It has to be the whole workspace or nothing. But when we have these issues of VS Code extensions, they are being updated all the time, right? So you might not always have a VS Code extension that matches the version of Angular you're currently working with. If you experience that problem, you can try downgrading a few versions of the VS Code extensions. There's a drop-down for that in the extensions pane if you find the Angular language service. That has worked for me a few times, not only with the Angular language service, also with other extensions.
Yeah, that's a piece of advice that I also received from one of my coworkers who was the first to experience that problem in our team. But I really hate the idea of downgrading anything. I mean, for example, imagine downgrading Angular.
Yeah, well, it's also that this is actually a dependency that works with different versions. There is even an Angular language service package in NPM, and it used to be a requirement. But at least for VS Code, it's not. You don't have to add that to your package JSON anymore. But I don't know about WebStorm, for example, or other editors. So you're always using the latest version by default of Angular language service, but it might not have full compatibility with earlier versions of Angular. So we could have, in VS Code, you can add an extension. I don't think you can add an extensions version resolver, but that would be nice if you could do that on a per project basis.
Yeah, that's definitely something we need to look deeper into, try to fix that. So I guess that's all with our questions on your presentation, Lars. Again, thanks a lot. It was really enlightening. So I guess at this point we can move to our final discussion and talk a bit about some more meta stuff like technical writing and open source and contributing to open source and all sort of things related to that. I guess lots of people that watch us now are constantly using content generated by both me, you, and all the friends that we have in the community. So some of them probably are wondering how all that stuff works. And I also know people that really would love to contribute to open source projects, or maybe fix bugs on tools that they use, or maybe suggest features or something like that, but they're don't really know where to get started, who to talk to, and how to get involved with all those sorts of things. So we thought it's a good idea to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, and maybe we could explain our backgrounds in this area first. And you could start, Armen. How did you get into public tech contributions?
Well, there is the path in writing, and there is the path in open source code. So I got into writing in, I guess, 2016 for the first time, but I didn't really. I wrote one article, and it was about writing some plugin for Gulp. Remember Gulp? Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was pretty horrible. My article was even more horrible than Gulp, and I guess it was useful for some people, but when I look back, I think like it was kind of a weak article. It wasn't really interesting. But after Angular 2 got released, and I started using it on a new project, I realized that I don't know lots about that, but all the things that I learn, I kind of want to write them down. And it doesn't really make sense to just write stuff and keep it to myself. So I thought, yeah, I have written one article, I can write a second one. So I just went forward and started writing articles on bad practices in Angular, and then best practices in Angular, or when I encountered an interesting, challenging problem which was solved in an interesting way, I wrote blog posts about that. So that's how I got into writing technical content. And about open source contributions, I'm not really the biggest open source contributor in the world, but of course you will remember that we worked with Tim from NGRX team on the ESLint plugin documentation for NGRX. It was a really interesting challenge. Lots of rules didn't have documentation pages, so Tim kind of suggested that I can work on that, and I like documenting things, and it's very useful because I believe lots of people are using the ESLint plugin for NGRX. So that was my real first large contribution. I didn't do much code contributions, though I have fixed several bugs on PrimeNG, well, admittedly minor ones, but I'm using PrimeNG in lots of our projects, so it made sense rather than to battle against the library and trying to do workarounds, just to create a pull request and fix the problem ourselves. So that's how I got into doing contributions in open source. So what about you? I always wondered that I met you, I guess, in the beginning of 2020, and you already were pretty much accomplished tech writer. And so what was your very first article or blog post about?
First article. So my first article was model view presenter with Angular. At least that's the first public one. I've been doing internal knowledge sharing for years before that. But that was my entry into the public knowledge sharing, which I now know and love very much. And that was actually based on a talk that my now good friend, 𝗪𝗵𝗁𝗁 encouraged me to do in the local Angular meetup, which was called NG Aarhus back then, and Aarhus is a city in Denmark. So yeah, it was about this model view presenter design pattern and how to apply it in Angular. And I really went overboard with both with the talk and then following with the articles. But actually, the reason I wrote the articles, it's a whole series now of, I don't know, 7 articles or so, the reason I wrote it was because I asked Max Koretsky, would this talk be interesting in the form of articles, multiple articles? And he said yes, and he was organizing the Angular in Depth publication back then. Now it's called indepth.dev, right? So that, and he was known, and his blog was known for high quality in-depth material. So I was how to say that, I was flattered by that he wanted to include my article. That meant that it was a good topic, so I just had to write it well as well. But yeah, I hadn't been writing a lot. I mean, I've been doing short, well, I don't know if they were short, but posts on internal blogs and documentation for developers in different teams and organizations. And so for this one, I went overboard, and I dove deep into all the topics from my presentations, also the ones that I didn't have enough time to figure out before that talk on a certain date. And I ended up spending, I must have spent something like 50 hours presenting that talk, my first public tech talk at the meetup, and I must have spent another 150 hours just for research and writing that article and the code that goes along with it. And I ended up, on the recommendation of Max, splitting it into multiple pieces, because even the first one I had, it was like a 45-minute read, which, yeah. Which
That's why you are writing a book now.
Yeah. So now I'm writing a book, then I don't have to keep to short articles. Yeah, so that was my first writing experience, and I've done a lot since then. And now I have my own publications open to the public as well. And yeah, I'm writing this book about Angular, my first book.
That's really interesting that the first experience in writing for you was kind of converting a public talk to an article. Usually the reverse happens. Like, I have articles about RxJS and Angular. Today I'm presenting the topic rather than I had a talk about RxJS and Angular, so now I'm going to write an article. So it's really an interesting change of ordering and doing things like writing articles. It's really nice to know your first steps. I guess the first steps you took in technical writing. I guess lots of people wonder about that, how they can get started and how they can kind of start writing content and try to do stuff like public talks and things like that. So maybe we can share some advice, and I would like to ask you, with all your experience you have in technical writing, for beginners, what is the most popular mistake that technical writers might do when starting writing content, and how can it be avoided? Kind of what are things that people are scared of doing, or maybe are doing wrong, or doing in not the best way, and they can kind of change that so that they are more assured when starting writing technical content?
Yeah, so just that, what are they scared of? I think a common issue is this imposter syndrome, just being scared of writing at all. So it's not a specific thing, it's just a notion of sharing something in public and exposing yourself to critique, and this might display me as not as good as Armen or Lars, whatever, and that's something that's something you'll be struggling with, even as an experienced writer, even as an experienced speaker. You might still have this, or you most certainly will at some point, because you will be facing new challenges, like standing in front of hundreds of developers at a paid conference or something like that. That's different from your local meetup, where you have all the time in the world just for your talk, and people are there to see you and no one else. So how to avoid it? Well, I definitely don't recommend doing what I did, trying to write an article for the most technically advanced blog on Angular as your first article, because then you'll end up investing hundreds of hours and still being at the point of, when is this good enough? Is it good enough yet? No, I must improve it. That's the common thinking there is, it's not ready yet, it's not ready yet, it's not good enough. So I have now started this community for public tech contributors. It started out for writers, but why not expand it also to speakers and open source contributors, both experienced ones, but also people that want to join and want to be in this. We have a private Discord server for all the writers and speakers and contributors. It's private only in that you have to ask me for permission to join, and I might ask you, what do you want to achieve? Oh, I want to start contributing to open source. Well, welcome. We'll help you get started and give you advice. So it's a free non-profit community, just a group of people. And the byproduct of this is, for example, the publications, This is Learning and This is Angular on Dev Community. This is, of course, I'm biased, but this is a good place to get started because there is no requirements on the format or the topics. It has to do with Angular, then you can publish it on This is Angular. Everything else, like career or other technologies, you can go and publish it on This is Learning. And you can ask for review, you can ask for tips, or you can just publish whatever you want. It's a platform for all of us to share what we learn and learn in public. And so seeing others having shorter blog articles, for example, and seeing other beginners might also make you more comfortable to do it yourself and speaking to them directly, especially.
Yeah, I would be honest that our Discord server really helped me grow. I published several other articles on both This is Learning and This is Angular, and I also got in touch with Tim and started working on contributing to open source. So I guess everyone interested in doing any contributions, either in the form of writing articles or maybe even just reviewing articles for the starting point, or doing open source contributions, are really welcome to our community.
Yeah, so that's one option. I have some questions for you, Armen. Now it's my turn to listen, your turn to talk.
Sure.
So, what is it that you like about tech writing in particular?
Well, first of all, that's a really nice way to wrap up your knowledge. Kind of when I learn something new, and a really good example of that is NGRX. I knew about NGRX for a while. I started using it kind of around a year ago, like really using in my projects. So I opened the documentation, then I opened some example applications, then I tried writing an example application, then I thought, yeah, I have to start incorporating NGRX into my existing projects and so on. And during all of that learning process, I thought, yeah, I now know how to kind of incorporate NGRX into an application. I'm going to write a blog post about it. I've watched several talks, and I think I know some best practices, kind of, and I also experienced some bad practices when writing, so I thought that it would be a good idea to write about that. And that was always like that. So anytime I faced some challenge or learned something, I thought that it would be nice to write about it. So probably for me, the best, something that just I experience is that when I write an article, I kind of know the stuff that I write about better. Even it sounds kind of counterintuitive in the way that I'm just writing what I already know, but it helps familiarize with the topic and kind of categorize all the thoughts that you have. Of course, that's one reason that only related to myself and my experiences, but in general, I also enjoy helping people to learn. As you know, I also participate in JavaScript and Angular bootcamp. I teach people JavaScript, and I mostly spend my time during work helping my team doing writing code on themselves. So it's a nice way of kind of putting your knowledge out there so people can experience it. So I guess that's the more outward effect of writing, helping people and helping people learn and grow professionally.
Sure. There is a question here from Elise in the YouTube chat. Maybe you can bring that up. And yeah, I can start by asking you, Armen, what is your routine? Do you have a system for doing contributions in addition to your daily work, so your actual job?
To be honest, I'm probably the most horrible person you can ask about the daily routine combination with doing other stuff, because I am used to really doing work in a chaotic manner. Like situations arise and I deal with them. That's kind of how I do my work. So usually I wake up early. That's not a goal. I just naturally wake up early. So I come early to the office, and while there's just me or no one else in the office, I can just sit down and maybe write something, an article, or write a blog post, or just think about something or work on some open source contribution. I wrote a new page for the NGRX documentation. It's about converting existing applications to use NGRX. It's in the PR review stage. And that's a good example of how I manage my routine, is that I open 4 projects. 3 are what I do at my office job, and 1 is the NGRX platform source code. And whenever I find myself like, yeah, for example, I fixed this bug, or I talked to this other developer, and now, wait, I have some open time. I can kind of switch to the platform code base, write something in docs. And then if a new situation arises, like there is a problem with my office job, obviously my office job is the first priority. So I would just abandon the code or documentation that I was working on in the open source. I will deal with my other problems there. So for me, it's kind of chaotic. But it's more about the open source contributions. When I do writing, I usually do that on Saturdays. So sometimes I will wake up on Saturday and I feel kind of refreshed, and I will be like, yeah, it's a good time to write an article. And as I mentioned in my article about how to write technical content, usually I have some bullet points from before. Like I would think about an article and I write a bullet point, then another one, and then I have a whole list of bullet points, and now I can just go over them and write paragraph by paragraph the article. So I can write 1 paragraph today, and 3 days later I would have an opening of time and I would write another paragraph, and then a week later I have an article. So for me, it's just more or less chaotic, I guess.
Well, I'm the opposite. I started 2 live streams this year, and they are called Angular After Dark and NX After Dark, because that's when I have time to do these extracurricular activities. Once my 10-year-old girls go to bed, I do wake up early, but it's either to drive 140 kilometers to work and come home late, or it's to wake up with the kids and prepare them for school or whatever. So my public tech contribution time is at night after they have gone to bed, which is later and later the older they get, right? So that's where I do my stuff. I don't have like a schedule. It's more of a, like I can have periods where I don't have as much energy for doing public contributions, and then I will recognize that and give myself some time to rest. But then I have very long periods where I basically don't do anything but public tech contributions, and staying energized with that, because that is what relaxes me, and something that's very enjoyable to me, and I connect to all of you people in the community, both in public and in our Discord servers and so on. So yeah, that's one method that I do have for balancing it all is I try to focus on two, let's say, not two things, but two categories, definitely, because there's speaking, there's writing, there's code contributions, there's mentoring, and live streaming and attending events like this one. So I will, writing a book, so I will try to focus on two at a time. So for example, right now it's about my book, and it's helping grow this community of public tech contributors. And then so that's two things already. And then from time to time, I'm switching out, so that instead of one of those two, it's like code contributions. I'm now maintaining a few, actually some Angular projects, the 𝗪𝗵𝗲𝗃 library for logging, the 𝗪𝗵𝗁 library for Angular integration testing. So that's not on a regular schedule or anything like that. It's whenever I have time to put that as my main focus, or one of two.
I see. So I have another question for you, and I guess for me it's interesting that you are contributing in different formats. For example, I know people that only write articles, but you, and at some point me too, but are doing different formats. Like you write articles, you are writing a book, and you're also doing public speaking, and quite a lot of it. So which format do you prefer yourself, and which one you find the most useful for people that eventually consume that content?
So each one has its benefits and its downsides. For example, with writing, I find that that's a good long-term investment. Something, well, depending on what you're writing. I mean, I'm not returning to your 𝗏𝗏 article anymore, but some of my articles I will refer to myself, so that's a personal benefit for me. I also think you were kind of saying this, that you can store that knowledge in writing for yourself, for your team, for the community, share it in public. That's very nice, both for me, and I see that people are also enjoying my writing for years and years, depending on the topic. So that's really nice. Compare that to public speaking at conferences. I mean, of course, that has the whole live event going through it, and in physical form, it's even better. But it's a short-lived experience. It's that 1 or 2 days, or one afternoon, or whatever, and then it's gone. And there might be a recording on YouTube, but it's a few hundred or a few thousand views compared to tens of thousands of reads on your articles over a period of years and years. So it's more of a short-term thing, but you get to connect with people directly, like you and me, and the other people, and Elise and Mahmoud and all of these nice people in the chat. That's not something you get to do as much in writing, although now we do have these communities of writers on In-Depth and This Is Learning and a few other places. So yeah, you can try to see how you can get the benefits of some of the other forms. I mean, so there's also code contributions, for example, and I have contributed smaller things to Angular over the years, and by doing so, I have kind of gotten to know some of the Angular members through that, right? And at least communicated with them, and they know my name from some commits maybe, and they help me how to contribute better and give me tips, and for, well, what I found even more enjoyable about code contributions is now I joined an open source team, this group known as NG Workers. So we're a team of 4 men from all over the world. We know each other, we trust each other, and we can work the heck out of a project when needed. So that's like being on a football team. That's also something, you get that social experience, that tight bond beyond or between people. So that's another unique experience and not really something you get from an article. I mean, for example, you and me, we collaborated on an article. And so that's another example of, you might get some of the same experience from the other forms, but it's more like speaking in public is more purely about making the connections with the people organizing it and with the audience and so on. And writing is more of getting known for sharing your knowledge and referring to that, and it's easy to find on the internet. So it's also a good way of branding yourself and your knowledge, and keeping that knowledge readily available, because referring to a talk is not as easy as referring to an article, because people would then have to scroll through hours of footage to find that one point, whereas an article, if you structure it well, they can skim through it and locate exactly the piece of information they need.
Yeah, I guess also Control+F is a nice feature.
Yeah, for sure.
By the way, Elise is asking, on which platform do you stream at night?
I have a YouTube channel. It's just my name, Lars ฎ Nilsson, like seen here in the chat. So you can find me there. I'm getting some limitations because I only have free license to StreamYard. So I've been on a break because right now I'm focusing on my book. So it's on a break right now. But from time to time, you might see me stream 20 hours in 1 week on that channel.
I see.
I see here a question that must be for you, Armen. It's from Inga.
Okay.
Yeah, you have also done mentoring at work and in public communities. What have you learned from being a mentor, Armen?
Probably the most important thing is that you never stop learning, and you kind of have to be very accepting about like mistakes and errors that you make on your way, because when I'm mentoring, sometimes you might be scared that what if I do something wrong in front of the people that I'm supposed to teach something? And that's a valid scare, let's say, in the way that, well, we know that people might think that you are not really good at something that you're explaining. But in reality, if you face a problem when mentoring, like you're doing live coding, showing people something, there is a bug and you just don't seem to fix that, that actually makes people more confident in themselves. Like they realize that when they struggle doing something at home, like learning a new pattern or solving a problem, that is exactly what happens to people that are actually teaching them. That is what happens on a daily basis. That's what I try to convey to my students, that it's normal to make mistakes and you are going to make them every day. As one wise man said, if the code didn't have bugs, we wouldn't need developers. So
that's
a more funny version of it, if debugging is the process of removing bugs from the code, then coding is the process of putting bugs in the code.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Hmm.
So what about open source contributions, and what would you advise people to know, the most important thing they should know before doing open source code contributions?
Well, I mean, a good thing about the world we live in today is that, for example, a lot of documentation is open source. For example, the Microsoft Docs, the Angular documentation, probably React documentation as well, even NGRX, RxJS. So a lot of that makes it easy to contribute, and documentation is a good place to start, at least like fixing a typo, or you're seeing something that doesn't make sense compared to what you're understanding. So I might raise an issue from time to time in the Angular documentation just for a one-line change. And they might say it can go two ways, right? It can be, you're an idiot. No, they wouldn't say that, but they might explain to me why it's like what it's saying. Or they might say, thank you very much for your contribution. Can you please change your commit description to follow our guidelines? So yeah, you will learn something either way. You will get the correct understanding, or you will help others get the correct understanding by adding the correct explanation in the documentation. And it's usually a really easy way to get started. I will say though that the Angular code bases are really hard to contribute to. Like getting that whole local development set up is difficult, especially on Windows. So I usually just either do it directly on GitHub, or I make the commits and then use the CI server for doing all the developer checks. So I don't do that locally because it's too much of a hassle to set that up every time I want to make a small contribution to Angular. So do something. Santosh Yadav had a very good tip, in my opinion, about this. And so he found himself doing contributions on many projects. And I don't know if he got the advice from someone else or he realized it himself, but the tip is find one project to contribute to, one that makes sense to you, one that you care about, and focus on that. And before you know it, you might become an Angular contributor, an official one, right? You might even be offered a job on the Angular team or something, or as a contractor, or for some other project that you care about. So rather than making sporadic contributions, not that they're bad, but you will get more of the benefit of connecting with the people behind the project and learning more about the project and the code base, the more you contribute to the same project. You might even be invited to an open source team, like, for example, the NGRX team has just accepted another member.
Yeah, I've seen that. So that was a really interesting discussion. I hope our answers of both of us helped viewers. Sorry, we have a small question from Elise. She asks if the NG workers members do public appearances, or is it fully private?
Yeah, public appearances. We have been on a few shows, both individually. I've been doing a lot of talks about our CI setup at the GitHub Satellite Conference, for example, and the BEJS and an Angular meetup. And we have also done some events together on some live streams, some different shows. So you might find that on YouTube if you search for NG workers. So that is one way of trying to like spreading the words about our projects that we care about very much, all the hours of work we put into that. And of course, we accept contributions. We don't have a lot of public plans right now about the libraries. Yeah, I don't know. Might be something we'll do more about in the future. But if you're interested in contributing, reach out to one of us, and might find something for you to do, or join the This is Learning group, and we're also in there, every one of us.
That's really nice. And hopefully we managed to help at least some of our viewers to engage more in the community and maybe start either contributing or maybe creating text content. So,
there's a nice question from Ilya.
Can you give advice to a junior developer how to be successful in IT?
Should I give an answer?
I guess I might try to answer this one. As with anything, I guess the most important thing is being as disciplined as you can get, always trying to learn more, always trying to grasp more, trying to solve more problems. And one nice touch on all of that is when you learn something new in your area, when you learn something that makes you think, yeah, I have been doing this wrong for a while. If you have time and the ability, go back and refactor your code. It's really helpful, and it really puts a perspective on how you grow. You realize that, yeah, you've been doing some stuff wrong, now you're doing some stuff right, and you are growing. So you will be both noticing how you go forward, and you will also be you will become more experienced during that process. So, everything else depends on all the efforts that you put into that. Yes.
I actually have one tip related to that question by Ilya. Avoid burnout, and one of the ways of doing that as a junior developer, you want to try to learn everything, but the problem is the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know yet. So it's really an endless cycle. So don't try to get yourself on board on trying to learn everything. In fact, try to stay away from what's directly applicable to your job. So in your spare time, if you want to learn more about code, try to find some topics that are not related to what you're currently using in your project, because then you'll feel the pressure of trying to figure it all out before that important deadline. And that's not a good use of your own time. So instead, try to find some more remotely related topics, or focus on something that's applicable to every project, like architecture, automated testing, DevOps, automation, things like that.
Yeah, I believe that's a good advice too, because obviously trying to learn everything is not really the approach that will help grow very deeply in one direction. So I believe that focusing and setting correct like milestone targets and going forward through that planned thing is the better approach than trying to grasp everything that will just make you burned out in the end. And here we have also a comment from our viewer, Matt, says, I would also suggest for all developers, especially new ones, to read the book, The Pragmatic Programmer, a set of principles that will guide for years to come. I didn't read that book, but I guess I will try to learn more about that and maybe read it. So that is also a piece of advice from one of our viewers. So I guess it was a nice discussion. I think it's time we wrap things up. So first of all, I want to thank everyone who has joined our live discussion today. Thanks to everyone who submitted questions. The questions were really interesting and helped us to learn more about the content that we're presenting. Of course, lots of thanks to you, Lars, for agreeing to do this and for actually going through all the steps that we
to come to this day. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I really enjoyed our discussion in the end. So I will be happy to attend other events together with you.
Nice.
Yeah, hopefully one day in person.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
And of course, my invitation for you guys, all from our community, to come to Armenia still stands. I'll be very happy to see you and also other members of our community here. So again, thanks for joining and watching our live discussion today. This was the first but not the last NG Meetup Yerevan, and we will try to come up with new events and new content in the future. So again, thanks for joining. Thanks, Lars, and also thanks to everyone who helped us do this event.
Thank you, Armen. See you some other time.
Thank you.